What is psychoeducation? According to goodtherapy.org, psychoeducation refers to the process of providing education and information to those seeking or receiving mental health services, such as people diagnosed with mental health conditions for life-threatening or terminal illnesses and their family members. Though the term has been in use since most of the 20th century, it did not gain traction until movements addressing the stigmatization of mental health concerns and working to increase mental health awareness began in earnest. Today, I want to talk about the importance of psychoeducation and its role in reducing stigmas of mental illnesses. Hi, I am Raysa, a survivor of narcissistic abuse, and I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and you are listening to Hello Trauma Brain, a podcast where I share my experiences living with complex PTSD. My hope is this podcast can help destigmatize mental health and provide support to anyone diagnosed with C-PTSD who thinks they might have it or has a loved one with this diagnosis. Quick reminder, I am not a licensed psychologist or mental health care professional, and this podcast is not meant to replace nor substitute the care of psychologists, other mental or medical health care professionals. If you think you might have complex PTSD or PTSD, please reach out to your primary care or mental health care provider. Any individuals and resources mentioned in this episode are not sponsoring Hello Trauma Brain. This episode may reference trauma or abuse, and listener discretion is advised. Remember, you can always pause or skip this episode at any time. And now, let's get back to the episode. Hello, dear survivors, and welcome to this episode of Hello Trauma Brain. Thank you for joining me today. If you are listening on YouTube, a gentle reminder to hit the like button and subscribe to let me know this episode was helpful. Quick check-in. I feel like I kind of want to skip the check-in this week because I'm not quite ready to talk about some of the major things that happened to me this week. I'm still in processing mode. Usually I talk about what's happening in my life, but right now it's a little too soon to speak about it publicly. So I'm going to keep that piece on my private life shelf for now. And at one point I probably will talk about that here, but I'm not feeling quite ready to disclose what's happening in the podcast, and I'm gonna listen to that intuition and shelf that for now. What I will share on my check-in, actually something just came to me, is something that happened this weekend while I was at my gig. I was doing a music gig. It was basically a charity gala for an organization that helps veterans obtain services that they need. It could be for getting disability, getting free counseling, or at one point they were talking even about getting medals to veterans that should have had the medal, but they had not had the medal. This particular story was involving someone who was about to pass away and they still didn't have the medal that they had earned. And long story short, they were able to make it happen. And the piece that I want to focus on for now is something that they were talking about that related to mental health and how veterans basically they struggle to get the services that they need because there's so much stigma associated with getting help for mental illnesses or mental health symptoms. At one point they were talking about veterans with PTSD and how some of them can be reluctant to seek counseling or mental health services using their insurance because it shows up or it could show up, and they were concerned about employers finding out, and that tends to deter them from seeking help, which is a problem because they need the help, and how this organization in particular offers free counseling services so they can get that help without the fear that they have about the insurance and all the implications that go from using that route. And it made me very sad to hear that. Part of me thought, that's a shame. It's a real shame that, that's happening. And it kind of reminded me of how I did that too. When I started doing therapy, I wasn't submitting it for many, many years. Most of my therapy has been out of pocket, 100%, not getting submitted to insurance. And I was scared of the same thing. I was scared of my employers like getting a hold of that information. And the thing is that in the United States, like, it's a protected class. Like, you can't be discriminated, or I should say it's illegal to discriminate against an employee or anyone based on a disability or a condition, and it includes mental health. But the issue is that the stigma's there. The stigma has been there for a long time, and it's at this point I do submit it. And I'm not gonna lie, I sometimes feel some of the fear when I do that, and quite frankly, I forget to submit it often. It's one of those things where, like, I can't help to think about, the stigma's there for a reason. Is there because there's a truth to it. There's a truth to being treated differently by people that don't understand mental health. That's, the veterans are not making it up. I'm not making it up. And anyone who's had this fear, you're not making it up. The laws that protect, disabilities and people with conditions from getting discriminated, let's face it, the reason the laws are in writing is because at one point or another, it became apparent that they needed to be in writing because someone was not following that by default. It kind of takes me back to thinking about why there's warning labels on all sorts of things. Like, for example, a microwave. Like, I forget where did I hear something about microwaves have to have some sort of label about not, putting some stuff on them because somebody already put the stuff on them. And I think at one point I heard something about somebody putting a cat in the microwave. And I'm like, who does that? But it's one of those things where it breaks my heart to think about if the law has been written for a certain thing, or if the warning label is on the thing, or if there's a fear about something. Like, most likely, not every single case, some warning labels, sure, they're written preemptively and whatnot. But, usually it's because someone at one point, did the thing that merited for the warning label or the law to get written, right? And it was funny because when I heard it during the event, I was feeling so sad for the veterans, and then it hit me the next day, and the next day being today, this morning, and it hit me like, oh, I used to do that too. That's right. I forgot I used to do that. I forgot that I used to get the bill, and I would just throw it on the trash because I had no intentions of submitting it to my insurance because I was afraid. That's just not how it should be. So yeah, that's my check-in, I guess. There's more to it, but for now, I'm gonna leave the rest inside my heart and my mind. And I have been talking to my close friends and members of my chosen family, I should say, about what's happening, and they've been so helpful and so validating, and they've helped me. They've helped me realize some things. They've offered me pieces of the puzzle that are helpful to look at as I am processing what happened. And I'll put it this way: there's grief, there's grief involved, and there's yet another loss, and a confirmation of something that I was afraid was true, and it turns out that it is. And yeah, I'm quite heartbroken about it, and at the same time, I kind of saw it coming. Two things can be true at the same time, huh? Today's episode, I want to continue this theme of Mental Health Awareness Month, and I decided to talk about psychoeducation because I think this is a really important concept for anyone who is looking into this content. Whether you have complex PTSD, or you're a loved one, or you're someone who just wants to learn more about complex PTSD, psychoeducation is a really important concept, and it has been instrumental for me in my own healing and in my own therapy journey. I first want to start off by talking a little bit about what I found online about psychoeducation on the website Good Therapy. What I read in the intro is basically the first paragraph of what they have for psychoeducation. And there's a few things that I've learned about it that I didn't realize. One of them being that studies have been done on psychoeducation as it relates to schizophrenia. And what they found was that it helped both reduce rehospitalization rates and decrease the number of days a person with a diagnosis of schizophrenia would spend in the hospital. I learned that it can be used in group settings, and I actually am experiencing that or have been in the past few months with the RRP group, the relationship recovery process mode of therapy that I have been doing. In our group, there's been a lot of psychoeducation, and basically like the first half of that group was all about psychoeducation, about childhood trauma. What does a healthy childhood look like? What does an unhealthy childhood look like? Psychoeducation about complex PTSD, about triggers, about the nervous system, how to regulate, and tools to regulate. Like, that's all been psychoeducation, and it's been extremely helpful. Psychoeducation about managing emotional flashbacks, that was a big one. And one thing that I learned, which, come to think of it, makes complete sense, is that psychoeducation can also apply to when the family members, partners, and people that are involved in the lives of the person that has a diagnosis, like psychoeducation applies to them too. Which is funny that I didn't see it that way, because that's kind of like what I even premise on this podcast, like it's for the loved ones too. And that is psychoeducation. Now, in goodtherapy.org, they talk about understanding the psychoeducation process. And I like the way they broke this down, because I saw a different article and I almost went with that, and it quite didn't resonate with me fully. And then I saw this and I was like, this is really what I want to drive home. Now, here's a few examples of what could psychoeducation look like. One way is a therapist explaining to a person in therapy the ways a mental health condition might impact function. Another example is a psychiatrist describing how a prescribed medication can counteract symptoms of a mental health condition. Another one is a psychiatric hospital providing support and education to family members of those receiving treatment. Another way is formal classes designed to educate the population about both specific mental health conditions and mental health in general. Another way is classroom behavior management assistance for students diagnosed with behavioral concerns. And the last one is self-help and support groups designed to encourage those diagnosed with mental health concerns to share strategies and information with one another. And I'm going to say that I guess the podcast kind of falls into that last category, like the self-help. Anyone listening to this podcast, you probably are engaging in some sort of self-help and self-psychoeducation if you're listening to this content to learn more about complex PTSD. And I'm engaging in this from the other side of sharing, what I know, sharing what it feels like to live with C-PTSD and what has been helpful to me. Now, Good Therapy adds that some people might receive psychoeducation through online or electronic formats such as DVDs, CDs, or other audiovisual materials, though others may choose to participate in sessions with a mental health professional. So I want to go ahead and share with you how my relationship with psychoeducation has evolved through time. And the reason I want to do it this way is because I think that by sharing how psychoeducation wasn't as helpful sometimes and how it has become more helpful might help you get an idea of what might work for you or not. So for me, psychoeducation is more helpful when you give me examples. So one of the things that I studied in my bachelor's degree was psychology. And in my psychology major, I learned a lot about psychology and different things. And quite frankly, like there were examples and there were some things that I could recognize. I want to say like with the OCD, I think I was suspicious back then that it might apply to me, but I wasn't 100% sure. And I feel like, I think the reason it went over my head, besides the betrayal blindness that was going on that wouldn't allow me to even see it, even if it hit me in the face. But I think a part of why it really went over my head also entailed that it was presented a little bit too intellectually, too factually based, kind of like, to give an example, like almost like what this intro was, right? Like when you hear a definition of psychoeducation according to blah 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 blah, psychoeducation refers to blah 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 blah, like it kind of goes over my head. And I'm more of a visual learner. Like to me, a definition that will be more helpful is almost like those examples that I gave about how it could look like self-help, or it could look like a psychiatrist telling a patient about the meds, or a psychologist explaining a condition and how it impacts the function of the patient. Like that registers a lot better than the intro of this podcast. Next, I think with psychoeducation, one part where I kind of fell through the cracks was in assigning me something to read and expecting me to read it. I feel like the first two therapists that I had would recommend books to me. And sometimes I read some of the stuff and sometimes I didn't. I feel like where the disconnect happened was I would be assigned the book. And, if I didn't get it and read it ever, it didn't get brought up again and we didn't talk about it. And I remember one time, something that was helpful was I got this chart of the Cartman triangle, and it was briefly explained. And, Cartman triangle deserves its own episode, but very briefly for those of you that are not familiar with it, it's basically like abuser, victim, and rescuer, and the roles can change. Like they can switch around between the three people. And it's a little bit more complicated than that. But I remember that hearing about that a little bit, and it was only applied to a specific relationship I was going to therapy for, and it wasn't applied to other relationships I was in. And that's where the disconnect happened. However, I will say that concept stuck with me a little bit more just because I had the visual of it, as opposed to the one book that I remember I was supposed to get that I never got. And I don't even remember what it's called. And I know I somewhere around here I still have the info for the book, and I just didn't get to it. I will say psychoeducation, when I started the support groups, that was extremely helpful in that setting. And what it looked like was hearing some of the symptoms other people were having, and hearing them say what it was. Like, oh, I'm experiencing this because I have C-PTSD. And then I would be like, oh, I have that symptom too. Wait, do I have C-PTSD? Like, that's how I became able to recognize I had it. I heard other survivors talk about it, and it just resonated so much. And then I started researching C-PTSD on my own and figured out that I have it. So yeah, I think that's an important part. And another important part for my own psychoeducation was hearing the examples of abuse. And let me explain that for a moment. When I started the support group scene, I had normalized so much of the abuse I had experienced that my definition of abuse was extremely, extremely narrow and specific to very obvious things. Like essentially, basically, like anything that was in the realm of the physical abuse was what I consider abuse. And I was there for that stuff too. But what I didn't realize was all the other types of abuse that you could experience, that I was experiencing constantly, and I didn't realize it was abusive. And it really took hearing my story, stuff that I dealt with every day coming out of a different mouth, and it really took like hearing it from the lens of this person was bringing it up from a place of being very upset that they were being abused in this way. My brain would be almost like, you could hear the DJ in the corner like, eh, eh. And my brain would be like, wait a second. What do you mean that's abuse? That happens to us a few times a day. That's abuse? What? And having that moment and then getting the language, changing that normalized frame to ringing a bell of this is abuse. That was big. And it helped me get that betrayal blindness off of me a little bit, because the more I realized how stuff that I just thought was just normal, stuff that I thought everybody was going through and it wasn't a big deal, like all of a sudden hearing that is a big deal, that shouldn't be happening. And actually there's people out there who don't experience this, because nobody should be experiencing that. That was a big wake-up call for me. And something that I want to talk about next is something that Good Therapy highlights here in their excerpt about psychoeducation, which is this type of education is also a component of most trauma therapies. Both of my trauma therapists now, they use psychoeducation with me. And I like the way they do it because they connect the dots. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. In the past, in therapy, when I was doing non-trauma focused therapy, I would get an example, but the dot wouldn't be connected. So it was almost like throwing a nugget, hoping I would just realize it on my own, which maybe for someone who doesn't have C-PTSD, it's effective. But if you have C-PTSD, at least in my case, I'm not connecting the dots. Sometimes, I remember this vividly. I remember my first therapist told me the story about a patient she had who didn't realize they were gay. And I remember thinking it was such an interesting thing to bring. I was like, why is she telling me this? And if you have heard episode 28, Proudly Coming Out, you know that I am queer. I'm bisexual. And I think my therapist picked up on it and was trying to give me this little hidden message of, you can be queer and not know it. But I didn't get it. I thought it was an odd thing to mention. I did think about it from time to time and wonder, was she trying to tell me something? Maybe not. Maybe she was trying to tell me something else. I kind of need the dot to be connected. And granted, I will acknowledge that I am a patient that really wants to hear it. And I realize that some other patients, they might not be in a place where they could hear you could potentially be queer, or I think you might be queer. And they might just fire the therapist and run out of the room. I get it. And maybe that's what I would have done back then, honestly. As much as I say I want to hear it, I don't know if I could have heard it back then. It wasn't safe for me to hear it back then. So there's a lot of moving parts here. But now as I do my trauma therapy, I feel like something that I have found helpful is this. Let me give you an example of what it looks like today. Recently, my therapist, so I do individual therapy and RP. It was the individual therapy. My individual therapist asked me, so I have noticed something you do, and would you like to hear it? And she gave me the option, and that's when I highlight, that is what makes trauma trained therapists so special. And let me just highlight that for a moment. That is why trauma trained therapy is so important if you are healing from trauma, because they understand the importance of consent, of giving the patient their autonomy back and giving them that choice. It's not just, she didn't just offer what she noticed without even asking me. She asked me, do you want to hear it? Would you like to hear it? And I knew, okay, I'm going to hear something that's probably going to be difficult to hear. And I sat there for a moment. I was like, yes, I do. I decided to hear it, but I got to sit there for a moment and choose, do I want to hear this now? Do I feel ready to hear it now or not? And I love that. And then she shared what it was. And I did get defensive at first. Like a part of me was like, fought it. I was like, really? And then I sat with it for another moment. I was like, oh, she's right. And then I sat with it for a whole week, or in between sessions, it was like a good 2 weeks. And then I came back 2 weeks later. I was like, oh, you're on the money about it. You're on the money about it. And I'm noticing it now that you told me. And I'm so appreciative she shared that and she connected those dots for me. Because here's the thing. And again, I'm talking about me here. I know not everybody is Raysa, and your experience might be very different from mine. But for me, I sometimes really need it laid out. It is really not obvious to me. It is just not obvious. Throwing a little nugget might not get me there fully. With psychoeducation, having that approach where the therapist gives me the example and it's a little bit more clear what they mean when they connect the dots for me. And it's not like they're telling me what to do. I know they can't do that. But there's something about really understanding complex PTSD and what they're dealing with that leads to the therapy looking a lot different than someone who doesn't understand complex PTSD. And I'm telling you that from experience, because I've had more than one therapist at this point. Another thing that I want to talk about is that psychoeducation is not going to do the whole trauma healing trick. I hate to be the person to tell you that it's an important piece and it's been very valuable to me, but I didn't heal my trauma by just Googling stuff, watching YouTube videos, and reading books. It was an important part of my journey. I was able to pinpoint I have complex PTSD, but you almost go like, okay, now what? How do you address this thing? And for me, it looks like joining communities. I've done support groups. I am literally doing 2 different types of therapy modalities right now. Well, let me phrase that differently. I have 2 therapists, and each therapist uses various modalities of therapy. Because I'm doing EMDR, somatic work, or somatic experiencing. I'm doing RRP. I do talk therapy still. And I feel like there's probably other things that I'm doing that I don't even know. Like they're just doing it with me, like, and I'm not even aware that it has a name. But yeah, there's a lot going on. Psychoeducation is just not going to fix it all. So the reason I'm highlighting this is because this is something that I did, by the way. And it's coming from a mistake that I have learned from. For the longest time, I really thought that if I could learn everything there was to be about the thing, I was set. And my chances of ever falling back for that were none. And painfully so, I have learned that it's not the case. Last piece I want to address with psychoeducation relates to the people that are listening to this, that are the loved ones of the person in your life who has the diagnosis or has the symptoms. The reason psychoeducation is so important for you too is because it helps you understand the experience of your loved one. Let me give you an example of how this is something that even applies to me. Like, I have complex PTSD, and I mostly expose myself to complex PTSD content because I'm addressing, how to live with this and how to improve my situation, etc. However, I also see videos for other conditions like borderline personality disorder or bipolar disorder. And it has been helpful for me to hear about other conditions because I know people with other conditions, and it helps me understand them and what they're experiencing. And I think it also has expanded my level of empathy. Like, it is one thing to hear, for example, bipolar, and another thing to really understand what it is, and to hear an interview with someone who has bipolar and to hear their experience. Like, it's, and I want to be cautious here. Like, this is not coming from a place of justifying abusive behavior. Like, if the person is abusing you, I don't care what they have. Like, abuse is abuse and it's not okay. However, what I want to highlight here and what is important to me is understanding a different experience, understanding how someone else navigates the world and what it can look like for them, helps me become more aware of a different reality, and it helps me hold better space for a different reaction to a situation. It helps me become more conscientious of accommodations I might need to keep in mind if I'm going to be interacting with that person. And I think the piece that I really want to highlight here is having curiosity. If there is anything I would love for you to take with you from this episode, is be curious. If you apply that concept to your life, every part of your life, you will notice something special happen. And I mean true curiosity. I became aware of that word when it came to communicating, but quite frankly, when I apply it to every single part of my life, I find myself addressing the situation from a place of compassion, of empathy, of wanting to understand what is the other person experiencing. And again, this needs to be, taken with with the understanding that it comes with boundaries, you know? You can have curiosity, and the concept of reciprocity still applies. Okay? And what I mean by that is if you're being curious with an abusive person and they are not being curious at all and they're just abusing you, it's okay to not be curious anymore and get yourself to a safer situation. Now, as I wrap up my reflection about psychoeducation, I want to highlight something that I think is really important when you're exposing yourself to content. Whatever you're consuming today, be aware that it can change. In a lot of licensed professions, at least the ones that I have been exposed to, you hear of something they call continuous education, and a lot of people with licenses usually have to engage in that. Like they need to continue to do seminars or conferences and expand and update the knowledge that they have. And that's because things change, people discover new things. And I think this is particularly the case for the field of psychology. There's studies being done constantly. There's new information coming in. There's an awareness that a lot of the studies that have been done excluded certain parts of the population that should have been included, and new studies need to be done. And that information will be updated. So when you engage in psychoeducation, remember that it's important for you to continue exposing yourself to updates on the matter. Like taking something that is said today as the whole truth and everything that will ever be true about this thing for the rest of your life. Be careful with that, because if it turns out that it's proven to be inaccurate later, it might change how things need to be done on your end, or how things need to be done for your loved one. It is okay to keep an open mind. What you're finding, it might not be applicable to you. That's another thing. Sometimes the content that we are exposing ourselves to, like, it might apply better to a different person and not you, and that's okay. And again, it kind of goes back to that curiosity. Stay a little hungry to keep an open mind to these concepts and new information coming in. And when in doubt, ask. Sometimes asking is such a powerful way to get that psychoeducation, Let's just say, for example, you're going to therapy and your therapist is not quite giving you psychoeducation, and now you're hearing this episode and you're wondering if they're going to get to that, or if that's something that maybe they're not doing for a reason. It's okay to ask them that question. Another example for those of you that are the loved ones listening to this content, let's just say you are trying to find ways to cope with something, and what you're finding online is not quite giving you the answers that you need. If you're able to have that conversation with your loved one and say, hey, listen, I really want to understand, how I can help you when X, Y, and Z is happening for you. And is there anything that I can do? Anything that you can point out that I can start looking up that might be helpful to you? Like asking those questions. And sometimes they won't know the answer. I think sometimes going to the actual source, can also be helpful. And yeah, that's all I have for now in terms of psychoeducation. I hope you found this helpful. In this week's Healing Invitation, I actually want to offer you a YouTube channel that I have found extremely helpful when learning about mental health. This channel is called Med Circle. And the reason I want to offer Med Circle in particular for this week is because Med Circle has content on all different types of mental illnesses or mental health disorders. It's not just about C-PTSD. They do have complex PTSD content, which I'm happy they do, because in the US it's not even recognized in the DSM, but I like that they are recognizing it in their content. And what I am going to invite you to do is check out Med Circle's content. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So if you want to learn more about either your own diagnosis or a different one, I invite you to check out a video from Med Circle. They do have a subscription that you can sign up for. However, they do have a lot of free content on YouTube that you can benefit from, especially if the financial resources are not there, or simply if you want to check it out before you even commit to anything. And their content includes both interviews or videos from experts in the field and also people who live with these conditions or disorders. And I think those are two very helpful frameworks to expose yourself to, especially if you've seen a lot of expert content. Hearing a person get interviewed who has bipolar or who has borderline, for example, it's just really informative to hear how life looks like for them, which is honestly a similar thing to what I am doing on this podcast. I feel like there's not enough voices from us, the peeps that are actually on the thing, living with it every day, and yeah, I find it extremely valuable. So there's my invitation. If you find a video that is helpful to you, I also invite you to share it with someone that you think might benefit from being exposed to that content. Please let me know how this week's healing invitation goes if you choose to accept it. Before we wrap up this episode, all music and production is courtesy of yours truly. Also, I want to share a few ways you can help support this podcast. You can subscribe and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or the platform you are using to listen. Share this episode with anyone you can think can benefit from this content. Follow Hello Trauma Brain on Instagram with the handle at Hello Trauma Brain. Subscribe to the Hello Trauma Brain YouTube channel and hit the notification bell to be the first to know when I post a new episode. And you can make a donation by getting me a coffee through the official bio site. No worries, all links will be provided in the show notes. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you found this episode helpful. I wish you the best as you continue your ongoing psychoeducation. It is time for our farewell affirmations. You are welcome to repeat after me. I am enough. I am lovable. And I deserve to heal. I wish you a gentle week, and thank you for listening.